Hilchis Tumas Ochlin Perikar Boser. Peres Shiyored Adlaf L'Teichon. Peres that the drip fell into these peres, it was Shalei Baratzin. And then the Irvon Kadeshi Yisnagvu. Knows the water fell, or the drip fell on some of the peres, but Lepel, it'll take a while for it to dry. So he mixed up the peres together, so maybe some of the moisture should fall on all the peres. And the point was not because he wanted the moisture on the peres, he wanted that it should dry quicker. So if the moisture will spread on all the peres, it'll dry quicker. So that's not considered that it's a ratzon. He wants it to be there in order to dry. So then, harlei hukshur, that's not called hukshur. Halacha beis. Hamayla peresiv legag mipnei aknima. He brings the peres to the gag. There's worms in the peres, and by bringing it up to the gag, the worms will go out of the peres. And lepeil is yared alei matal. Being on the roof, yared alei matal. The din is lehukshur, because he brought it up in order because of the knima. He wasn't interested in the tal. However, v'im neskaven sheyered alei matal. But if he did have kavana sheyered alei atam hukshur lefichach. Since the din is that be'etzim bringing it up is not a hechsher, is not really doing an act for the tal. It's just that if he has to have kavana in order to have this hechsher, lefichach im helam cheder sheita v'kotten, is aval pi shechishvu sheyered atal aleim, but lepeil lehuksheru sheyesh meislem din teira. A cheder sheita v'kotten has a maisa. In other words, if they do something and that act is clear what the act means, it's not only an indication, it's mamish clear. Marshal, a chereshet v'kotten would pour water on top of peres. So obviously, it's what they're doing is they're doing something l'rotzen. They're pouring water on top of peres. So that ma'isa would be machsher. Sheyesh no ma'isa din teira. But ve'ein le machshava afilu m'divrei sefer. I know water is tal is falling on them, and in order for it to happen, it's keilu through their machshava. You want their machshava should be pale, that it should be l'rtzeina. Their machshava doesn't have a din machshava. Their ma'isa has a din ma'isa. If they pour water, and it's obvious that they're pouring water l'rtzeina, so that's pouring water. Masha'inkin, if it's the tal is falling, and they have a rotzen for it, so it's ein le machshava afilu m'divrei sefer. Now hipchu bem ktanim al agag. If ktanim went ahead and took these peres that were on the gag, and they were mahapichet, so memela it's clear why they mahapichet in order for the tal to fall on it. So the ma'isa is, it's not the ma'isa that they're pouring water on the peres. When they're pouring water on the peres, the mamish, that's a ma'isa. Over here, it's not a ma'isa. It's a machshava which is muchach from a ma'isa. In other words, it's not happening through the ma'isa. Turning over the peres is not really going to make the hechsher. Turning over the peres is a raya that this is what they have in machshava. But lepel, they don't have it in machshava. Even a machshava, which we could see from their ma'isa, is also not enough. They have to have a ma'isa, which that ma'isa is doing it. In other words, they're pouring water, so that's mamish machshir. Masha'inkin, when there's a machshava, which is muchach from a ma'isa, so that's only midivrei seif musunsi. Nachamal. Hivchu bem ktanim al agag is harele muksharim. Then they are mukshar. But shemhoisa machshava shel cotton nikeres mitech ma'isov. So then is machshavti me'elis midivreim. So there's three madregas. There's a machshava mamish, doesn't work at all. If it's a ma'isa, so it works even minatera. Masha'inkin, if there's machshavti nikeres mitech ma'isov, so it's not a ma'isa. The ma'isa doesn't really make the hechsher. It's the machshava that makes the hechsher. But it's a machshava which is nikeres mitech ma'isov, so then it works with the rabbanon. Now the ma'isa is, the Rambam spoke b'negeya acher sheit v'kotten. So b'negeya acher sheit v'kotten yesh le ma'isa ve'en le machshava. That's on a minatera dika level. Minatera dika level is yesh le ma'isa and ein le machshava, even on a rabbanon dika level. Cotton, that's the Rambam brings from the Pri Megadim and Reish Yosef and Chul, that he says a cotton. This is only a din by a cotton, not a cheresh sheita, a cheresh and a sheita. Whereas the cheresh and sheita would be mahapich. The peres breish agag doesn't say in the Rambam that b'chi agavna would also be mukshel lekabel tuma. But negei cotton, so a machshava which is nikeres mitech ma'isov is machshavti mi'elis midivreim, but not a cheresh sheita v'cotton. A ma'isa would help. Masha'inkin a machshava nikeres mitech ma'isov, which only works with the rabbanon, is only by a cotton. That's the pashtus advar. Halachi gimel. Hamayles or agudes vesaktsies vesashum legag. Those you have bundles of vegetables, or ktsies is dried figs, or shum is garlic, and you're putting it on the gag, b'shul sheyamtina, you want to preserve it, so putting it up on the gag will preserve it. And lepeil v'yared aleim gag, hatal. But that wasn't the purpose of bringing it up to the gag, is lehuksheru. Ve'neinim hail v'hakil yedin shatal yedid. So if you go, you bring it up to the roof. So likten, what you're doing, that you want to bring the tal. No, ve'neinim hail v'hakil yedin shatal yedid hazer zibetzeini. Sharei lehelam ela kadesh yamtinu, which is l'chura the same din will be in halacha beis. I mean, the Rambam is saying it actually in halacha gimel. L'chura chamayla peres legag neachnimo. Also over there, you can say ve'neinim, eineinim. I'm not sure why the Rambam says it over here, not over there. Halacha dalet. Hamoilech chitim litchen. Person is bringing his chitim in order to grind them, to make them into flour. And v'yardu aleim kshamim. Is im samach, if he was happy by the kshamim, the fact that the kshamim made it wet, maybe it's going to help the chitim, is huksheru. Mashenkin, if not, not. Now, hoyev zeisav nesunim begag, and v'yardu aleim kshamim, is again, im samach huksheru. Hachamorim shehoyo evrim banor, people that were hachamorim, people that run that are transporters with donkeys. They were passing a nor, and v'noflu sakeim b'mayim, and the sakim that were full of tvuah or peiros fell into the mayim, v'helum, and they brought it out of the mayim. So the shaila is im somchu, if they were somchu, is hukshra peiros. So first of all, the peiros that became wet is hukshru, because lepel their samchu, and also v'hamayim shalasakim hinam tlushim berotzim sharei samchu. Now the mice is they weren't samchu about the mayim which was besakim. They were samchu about the mayim on the peiros. So the mayim on the peiros, since it was berotzim, so obviously the peiros are muksher. Now lepel the mayim that's on the sakim are not berotzim. But nevertheless, so why they call Tlushim Beratzim, says we learned before. We learned just like we learned when a person drinks water. So Memela, the water that's on his lips are also considered Tlushim Beratzim, even though that's not what he was interested in, because it's inevitable. Since he's interested in the water, and on the other end, it's inevitable that it's also going to go on the lips. So the water on the lips is Tlushim Beratzim. Al-Deraz over here. Since the water, he wants the water for the peiros, and if the water is going to be on the peiros, inevitably it will also be on the sakim, because the sakim, the peiros are the sakim. So that causes that the mayim that is on the sakim should be considered tlushim beratzon. That's what he's saying. Nochamol achamorim she'evim benor v'naflu sakeim b'mayim v'helum im somchu. If they were happy about the fact that the peiros fell into the water, is hukshara peiros. That's the number one, and then number two is v'mayim shalasakim. Hinam tlushim beratzon. Why? Shari somchu. It doesn't mean somchu about the sakim. There was somchu about the peiros. Since there was somchu about the peiros, so that causes that the mayim shalasakim should be considered tlushim beratzon. Halacha hey, sak shumoli zirenim, and v'nosn al gabi hanor el pi aber el mailas hamor. You have a sack which is full of seeds, and lepel it's right next to the bank of the river, or by a bear, or by the mailas hamor, the steps going down to a maira, which is a mikvah. And lepel v'shavu, they absorbed the water, the moisture from the river or from the bear or from the molas hamayra is hukshu. Because with pashtus, if you have it there, the pashtus you're interested in it being there, and memela, so that water, that moisture that's coming onto these zirenim, which is coming as a result of this body of water that it's next to, is considered mayim, which is being machsher these zirenim. Halacha vov, chavis shehim leapedis. So notice, even though mamish, there's no water mamish that fell on the zirenim. The zirenim are standing next to the nor, and lepel is becoming wet from the evaporation pashas of the nor, which is going onto the zirenim. Is nevertheless, so since lepel is there, and we assume that it's beratzim, so therefore it becomes muksha lekabel tuma. Chavis shehim leapedis. You have a closed chavis, which is full of peiros, and you put it into mashkin. Or fakert, a malaya mashkin, you have a closed chavis full of mashkin, and shenosna b'teicha peiros, and you put it into peiros. And lepeil v'shava, the peiros became wet. Either the peiros in the chavis became wet from the water that was outside, or the peiros on the outside became wet from the water, from the mashkin which was in the chavis. So the din is hukshiru. So the peiros became huksher, even though they didn't come into direct contact with the water. It went through the wall of the chavis. Nevertheless, because they became wet as a result of that mashka, is huksher. Be'ela mashkanom, what kind of mashkan would we say that it goes through a chavis? Is b'mayim, and ubiyayin, ubechemes, and in vinegar, which is also from wine. Avol sh'ara mashkin, other mashkin, of the other four of the Zayin mashkin, ein mishavin min acheres, kadei sheyish yachshiru aperish betzidam. You wouldn't be able to have that water, that mashke should go through the cheres of a chavis. A chavis made out of is a klicheres, and it should make the peris on the other side wet. That moisture wouldn't be able to go through the chavis. B'sheink and mayim, yayin, and chemetz. These are two of the mashkin, because chemetz is yayin. So they could go through a cheres, and memela it could become mukshar lekabel tumah. Hareda paschama. A person takes paschama out of the oven. Unesana al pi chavis shel yain, and there's a chavis, an open chavis of yain, and you put the paschama on top of the chavis shel yain. Is imhoya pas chitim? If it was pas chitim, is lei huksheru. So that pas, it doesn't become muksher from the yain. We don't say that it absorbed the wine. In other words, it's not touching the wine. The question is it absorbing the wine from the air, so to speak? So we say no, that chitim are not that absorbent. However, if it was barley, is huksheru. Because barley is shayav this moisture. We say that the wine was absorbed by the seirim, and therefore the seirim became muksher. So this was minigeh whether it's huksher lekabel tumah. The same thing was if the yain was tummy. It's still tehera because lepel it didn't absorb the wine, so it didn't become huksher, it didn't become tummy. It works both ways. The sheiva has a din of huksher and causes tumah. Halacha ches. Hamarabitz is basic. A person pours water in his house in order that the dust should settle, and v'nosen bechitim, and then he put chitim into his house, and v'tonanu, and those chitim became moist. Now, Weiss is that chitim didn't actually touch the floor. We're not questioning if it actually touched this wetness in the house. It's a question that it became moist from the para that was in the house. So there was the moisture in the house that causes the chitim to become wet. And the question is, where is this moisture coming from? Is it coming from the water that he poured in the house? Or is it coming from the water or from the moisture which was absorbed in the floor of the house? Or is it coming from the moisture that was absorbed in the floor of the house? Is Nachamal. Hamarabitz is basically someone that pours water in his house, v'nosen bechitim, and he put chitim in the house, and v'tonanu, and those chitim became wet. Is imachmas hamayim, if the wetness of the chitim came as a result of the water which he poured in the house, is huksheru. The imachmas hasel, if they're coming actually from the floor of the house, so even though that floor, let's say, absorbed some water, and now from that floor there was coming also moisture, so that moisture that comes from water that was absorbed doesn't have a din of mayim, and therefore that can't be machsher the kaleb. That can't be machsher the kaleb. Now, how do you know if it's coming from the mayim or it's coming machmas hasela? So the Rambam says that you have to be basic. You see, if the floor was wet, so then you're chayshish that those chitim came from the water. It came from the water. In other words, the wetness came from the water. Mashenkin, if the floor isn't wet, so then you could assume that it's coming machmas hasela, and therefore if that moisture is coming machmas hasela, is lehukshu. Again, moisture that's coming, in other words, you could have moisture that's coming machmas hasela, but that moisture that's coming machmas hasela is not considered mayim. Hamechabes is ksuse ba'areva. He washed his ksus ba'areva, so there was water there, and then v'nosen b'chitim, and then he put chitim into this areva, v'tonanu, and the chitim became also moist. Is imach mesamayim, or if it, as a result of the water which was in the areva, it became moist, so then it's huksheru. That's l'chore pashut. L'chore that would be pashut. Masha'en b'mach areva. If it's from the water that was absorbed in the areva, is lei huksheru, then it's lei huksheru. Notice again, the kudas hadvarim is that moisture that comes in the air, that's caused from water that was absorbed, that can't cause that there should be a hechsher. Only water, if there's actual water, so even though you're not touching it, like we had before by the bear, you had a chitam next to the nohar, next to the bear, next to the Milas Hamayra. So over there's actually a body of water, and even though it didn't actually touch the body of water, it was just moisture that was coming from the body of water, but that moisture caused the hechsher. Mashenkin over here, when you have moisture which is it absorbed somewhere, and then that moisture is causing something else to become moist, so that is not going to cause hechsher. Now, earlier we had a case where you had peiros, for example, in a chavis, and there was water next to it, and nevertheless, and those peiros became wet, so the peiros are hochshers. Now, how did it happen? So what happened is that the water was absorbed in the walls of the chavis, and now from that walls of the chavis, it went to the peiros. So over there also we're saying the moisture came from something that was absorbed in the walls of the chavis. So how is that different than the areva over here, where we say the water was absorbed in the areva, and now it's becoming moist from that water that was absorbed in the areva? So the answer is over there, the water is still connection. There's still water there. There's water. Notice this chavis is in water. You have a chavis mlea peiros that's in water. So there's water going into this chavis, and from the chavis, it's coming out moisture to these peiros. So since there's still a connection to a body of water, so therefore that moisture does have a din of moisture, even though it's going through a actual chavis, a wall. So the you say that the wall is getting it from that water. Lapel right now is coming from the wall. We say no, that since lapel, that wall is still connected to the water on one side, so the moisture that's coming on the other side to the peiros has a din of something that could be machshir. Masha'inkin over here, we're talking about there was an areva, and there was water, and that areva absorbed some water. Now the water is no longer there, and now this is becoming wet from the moisture that was absorbed by the areva. That's different. That's the Rambam Aruch writes this. Halacha tes. Hatoimin peiros bechel kedei sheyartivu. He put it into the sand, and the sand has moisture in it, in order for the peiros to become moist, should have a certain wetness. Is huchshiru. Hatoimen betit hanoguf, in dry tit, is im yesh be mashke tifeach, if there's still some wetness on this tit, is hochshru. Abivim lav le hochshru. Notice again, because if there's mashke tifeach, so it's considered mayim be'en, like it's mashke be'en. So since it's mashke be'en, so that could cause moisture to the peiros. Masha'inkin, if you're talking about something which is absorbed already in the tit, it's absorbed in the tit, there's no longer mashke be'en. So then, even though it's going to cause a little bit wetness to the peiros, but that's not considered something which could be machshir the machshir the peiros. Halacha yud. Amirabitz is garnei. Person has a garden, which is a place where he threshes, threshing floor, and he went ahead and he also put some water on it in order for it not to for the dust to settle. So the din is any cheshish shem yukshiru chitav im tonnu. If a person brought his chitim over there and they became a little moist, you're not going to say it became moist from the water. And even though he's happy that it became moist, because lapel, we assume that since a threshing floor is usually very dry, and you put a little water there, so we could assume that water was absorbed very quickly, and it's highly unlikely to say that the actual water, which was above the threshing floor, is what caused that these chitim should become moist. It must have become moist from the water that was absorbed by the threshing floor. And therefore, as we said before, that water no longer is capable of being machshir. Halacha Yud Aleph. Hamalakid asabim kshatal yered aleim lechapis behem chitim. He wants to cover chitim, and is using grass, and the grass has dew on it. Is lehuchshiru, because that wasn't his intent. His intent was just to cover the chitim. The fact that it happened dew on it wasn't negate to him. However, if he wanted that the grass that has dew on it should be on these chitim. In other words, there was some inyan in the dew being on the chitim, so then it's huksharu. Now, Hamrabitz is base b'mayim tmeim. A person washes his house, puts water on his house with water that's a tummy, and then v'nosim b'shibolim, and he puts stalks of wheat. There's not actually kernels of wheat, actually stalks of wheat, and v'tonu, and they became wet. Is again, yesh aleim mashka tifeach. If there's still mashka tifeach on the floor, so then it's arelu tmeim. So then these shibolim become tummy. The chita becomes tummy. However, vimlav is terim. So in other words, this didn't apply side benegea hechsher kabbalah stuma. And now we're saying the din that we learned before, and now we're learning that the same din applies benegea becoming tummy. Halacha yud gimel hanoyer agudah shel yerek shehoyo ala mashkin. There was mashkin on this agudah shel yerek. And lapel, this mashkin was agudah shel yerek was shalei beratzin. It was nitla shalei beratzin. And then the yardu mitzad elyon l'tzad hatachten, he shook it, and it went from the top part of it to the bottom part of it. So it went like kilo from one yerek to another yerek is lehuksher, because lapel it sits in agudah shel yerek and it's considered one thing. So it's not considered nitlash. It wasn't nitlash because it's still in the same aguda that it was originally, just like we had before. But the Elon, if it goes from one part of the Elon to the other part of the Elon, it still remains in the same place. Halacha Yudalit. Hamayle sakin maleim pedis min anor. And v'nosnon zelga bizei, he put the sacks one on top of the other. He didn't put it next to each other, put it on top of each other. So the din is huksher hatachten b'mayim shiyordu liminelin. So since he put a sack which had wetness in it, and he put it on top of the sack under it, so the water from the higher sack is going to go down to the lower sack, and we assume that that's what he wanted, and that's why he put the higher sack on the lower sack. This is what he wanted to do. So the water that goes from the higher sack to the lower sack is considered hutlash b'rtzeini, and memela it's machshir. Halacha tezvov. Hanefeach ba'adashim lebot kodim him yofis. Because he wants to see whether the lentils are good. So mainly he blows on it, and when you blow on it, so like a certain moisture comes out in blowing from the moisture of the mouth, and that'll see whether or not these lentils are good or not good. And they'll see how it absorbs that liquid. The hizio and lepel, those lentils started sweating, and others became wet. So the din is huksher will behevel piv. So they become huksher, and those in that blowing, there's a certain moisture that's coming from the mouth, and that moisture went onto the lentil, so these lentils became muksher, because the moisture in the mouth is considered tuldas hamayim, which is from the zayin mashkin. A person is eating sesames, so he has l'mashal sesames in his palm, and he wants to take some sesames and put it in his mouth. So what he does is he wets his finger, then he puts it on the sesames which are in his palm, and he puts his finger on those sesames. And now some of those sesames get stuck to his finger, and then he puts it to his mouth. Is hukshru, so the shumshman become hukshru because of the mashka shebepivish halatzboy, those mashka which is in his mouth, and now that's on his finger. So in Mela, they're machshir, the sesames which he picks up with his finger, or the sesames that he touches, which doesn't even go on his finger. So those sesames become mukshir lekabel tumah, because the mouth, the moisture of the mouth is mekabel tumah. So that's the two dinim. Side in efer ba'adashim is the moisture of the mouth that's going on the adashim, and al is over here, the moisture of the mouth, which is going onto the sesames. Halacha tezayin. Noshach be'echel, a person bit off a piece of food. Now obviously when he bites off a piece of food, so the food that's in his mouth becomes wet. And now v'nafel echel, the food that he bit off fell. So now the question is, this mashka, which is on the food, it was mashka, it was mayim. So we say, mashka shalo echel shalei rotzen. He wasn't interested in the food that was in his mouth becoming wet. What he was interested in was to eat. Lepel, it became wet. So now that food that which is now came out of his mouth and it fell out of his mouth, is not considered nitlash b'rotzen. He's not interested in that. He never was interested really in that moisture going onto this food. He has moisture in his mouth. That's natural. He has moisture in his mouth, and he has the food in his mouth that he wanted to eat. But now you have this moisture which is on this food that came out of his mouth by accident. So that's considered. It was nitla shalei b'rotzen. It came out of his mouth shalei b'rotzen. However, hoya oichel zeisim tsuim utmorim retuvis. He was eating zeisim, olives, which were cut up olives, or tmorim, which were soft tmorim, which weren't dry tmorim, retuvis, and v'chol she'uretz lomutz is garinos, is something that he wants to suck out from the pit, and then v'nafel bepiv, and this thing that he was sucking out fell out of his mouth, is hariya mashke shalu berotzen. So that mashke which was on this food, which was in his mouth, which he wanted to suck out, was berotzen, because he was interested in the saliva going onto the food, because that enabled him to eat it. So no, the kudas is the moisture in his mouth it has a din of moisture, and memela. So and now that moisture goes ahead and gets onto the food. So the question is it considered moisture which was nitlash berotzen? Is it considered nitlash berotzen? Is it considered bechlal hukshe berotzen? So over here, the din is that if he's interested in the moisture going on the food, so then that moisture is considered machshir, and memela it's muksher lekabel tumah. Masha'inkin, if he's not interested, so then it's not muksher lekabel tumah. So that's the difference with these two. But a regular piece of food, he's eating a piece of food, he's not interested in the moisture going on the food. So therefore, it's not huksher. So memela, if it falls out of his mouth, it's not going to be makabel tumah. Masha'enkin, if he had this food that he needed the moisture to go onto the food, because that was the way of eating it, that the moisture was mixing with the food. So then that mashke is considered mashke, which is l'ratzon, and therefore if the food gets out of his mouth, so it could be muksher l'kabel tumah. Is that a mashke shala b'ratzon, and the mele it could become muksher l'kabel tumah. Now hoye oichel zeisen neguvim utmar so if he bit off a piece of food, so normally we say the mashke shala eichel shalei l'ratzon. If he's eating zeitzim suyim utmar mertuves, or anything that he wants to lomutz, so the v'nafel mipiv, so then we say ariyah mashke shalav is yeberatz, because he was interested in that mashke mixing with the food. Hoya oichel zeisen neguvim utmarim yeveshes. He was eating either dried olives or dried dates, and v'chol she'ener reitz olamas is garinosi, something that he's not interested in sucking out its pit. And then v'nafel mipiv is that a mashke shalav is shalei b'rotzen, because he had no interest in the mashke mixing with the food. Halacha Yud Zayin, ulshin endives shalikton lebehema, which you gathered for a behema. So mele doesn't have a din of eichel adam, has a din of eichel behema, and then v'hidichon, and you want diachit. So the pale, whilst it's eichel adam, there's no din of being muksher lekabel tumah. It's not eichel. Now v'chishiv aleim le'echel. Now you decided you want to eat it. So the fact that it was huksher while it was a Michael Behema is not going to help when it's a Michael Adam. Is kfar biyarner shesheim tzrichim herach shesheni. Now they have to be huksher a second time. That's talking about when if it became dry. In other words, it was chishav aleim lebehema, and then they dried, and now it's chishav aleim le'adam. So again, you have to put it on again. Yeah, you need that mashke shvul again. However, mhoya aleim mashke tifeach shechishav aleim le'adam. Whereas the water was originally, the mashke was originally put on it while it was chishav aleim lebehema, when it had a din of Michael Behema. But then it changed from being a Michael Behema to becoming a Michael Adam, and it's still wet, is a reila muksharim. Just like the same din, if you mashal, while food is attached to the ground, so that food cannot become muksher. Masha'enkin, if that food is wet, and then you detach it from the ground and it's still wet, so then it does become muksher if it's beratzen. Because it doesn't have to fall on it beratzen, it has to be on it beratzen. So as long as it's on it while it's a Michael Behema and it's beratzen, so Mamela, it has a din of being muksher lekabel tum.